Everywhere you look in California cities, it's hard to ignore the growing number of homeless encampments. And the pressure to address this, to clear these camps, it really seems to be intensifying daily.
It's certainly a focal point right now, yeah. Raises a lot of questions about public spaces, community well-being, and, well, the lives of the individuals in those encampments.
So in this deep dive, we're tackling the complexities surrounding this push to ban and evict homeless encampments, particularly here in California. We've pulled together a really diverse set of sources to help us get a clearer picture.
We have indeed.
Yep.
We'll be drawing on an article from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. It looks at the real costs and, frankly, the often disappointing outcomes of these eviction efforts.
Right.
Then there's a detailed fact sheet from the California Senate Housing Committee offering some crucial data on the sheer scale of homelessness in the state.
Plus, we're looking at recent news coverage, Associated Press, and directly from the governor's office outlining Governor Newsom's, strong stance in favor of encampment bans and this state model ordinance they've put out.
Mm-hmm.
We've even dipped into a Reddit discussion to capture some of the, local feelings around this.
And rounding out our sources are a report from San Jose Spotlight highlighting the concerns and protests of homeless advocates.
Yeah, that's an important perspective.
And also a CBS News analysis of that recent Supreme Court ruling and its pretty significant implications for how cities can legally approach camping bans now.
Okay, so our goal today is to really dig into this. We want to understand the financial side, the very real impact on human lives, and the ongoing, often kind of heated debate that's happening not just in California, but, across the country, really.
Right.
Okay, let's dive in.
Let's start by looking at what's driving this push for encampment bans. Governor Newsom has been quite vocal recently, urging cities and counties in California to take more decisive action.
Absolutely. And it's not just talk, right? The governor's website details the release of a model ordinance. You can think of this as a sort of template for local government.
Exactly. A template to help them develop their own strategies for addressing encampments.
Okay.
And the stated aim of this model ordinance is to establish clear procedures for enforcement, but with a significant emphasis on connecting people in encampments with shelter and services.
Right. The justification being public safety risks, unsanitary conditions, that sort of thing.
That's the frame, yes.
Yeah.
And addressing those conditions.
This initiative is also connected to a pretty substantial amount of funding, isn't it?
It is. The governor's office highlights the $3.3 billion allocated from Proposition 1, which is specifically targeted at expanding behavioral health housing and treatment options.
Mm-hmm.
Governor Newsom has emphasized the urgency of the situation, framing it as a necessity to act now and get people the care they need.
It's also worth remembering, I think, that California voters recently approved a measure back in 2024.
That's right.
Mandating that counties allocate funds towards housing and drug treatment programs. So there's this clear statewide momentum building.
Yeah, a broader strategy. And these encampment bans are being presented as one piece of that puzzle.
Now, this model ordinance, it lays out some key provisions. It includes a prohibition on what's being termed persistent camping.
Right.
Bans on encampments that block sidewalks, which, intuitively makes sense for accessibility.
Sure.
And crucially, it mandates that local authorities provide adequate notice and make genuine offers of shelter before any encampment is cleared.
And all these local actions, they're happening under the shadow of a very significant Supreme Court ruling. City of Grants Pass v. Johnson.
Okay, yeah.
As both the National Alliance to End Homelessness and CBS News reported, this case looked at whether fining or arresting people for sleeping outdoors when there's literally no shelter available counts as cruel and unusual punishment.
Under the Eighth Amendment, right. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Supreme Court's ruling clarified that those fines or arrests don't automatically violate that clause.
Right, not automatically, but, and this is a critical nuance, the court also acknowledged that you can't punish someone for a basic human need like sleeping if they genuinely have nowhere else to go.
So what's the implication then?
Well, it's fascinating. While outright criminalization just for sleeping outdoors might face legal hurdles, the decision leaves the door open for civil penalties.
Ah, okay.
CBS News points out this could very well lead to an increase in encampment bans that rely on these civil infractions, things like citations for loitering or obstructing public access rather than direct arrests for being homeless itself.
Got it. And just to bring in a real-world perspective, that Reddit discussion in Barbaria shows that Governor Newsom's call for these bans is definitely stirring things up locally. Lots of discussion.
Oh, I'm sure. A wide range of opinions, definitely.
Yeah.
Now let's pivot maybe to the financial side of these encampment evictions.
Okay.
The article from the National Alliance to End Homelessness provides some, well, crucial economic insights that often get overlooked.
Right. So we're talking about more than just, moving people and their stuff. This article references a 2019 report from HUD and HHS
Yeah.
that meticulously analyzed the costs associated with encampment responses in 4 different cities:
Yeah.
Chicago, Houston, San Jose, and Tacoma.
And their findings. They reveal a pretty complex breakdown of expenses. First, there's the direct cost of removing structures, belongings, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have the resources for the physical act of moving people. And finally, the costs of outreach efforts trying to connect those displaced individuals with services or housing options.
And the price tag for all of this, it varied quite a bit, didn't it?
It really did. The 2019 report found the total cost per unsheltered person ranged from about $1,672 in San Jose,
Okay, 1672.
all the way up to a, frankly, staggering $6,208 in Tacoma. Chicago and Houston fell somewhere in between.
Wow, that's a huge range, over $6,000 per person in Tacoma.
Exactly. And what's striking isn't just the dollar amount, but that discrepancy.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests the approach taken matters a lot.
How so?
Well, the level of law enforcement involved, how intense the outreach is, even the city's geography, it all likely plays a role in driving up those costs. Makes you wonder if a more standardized, service-focused approach might be more, well, efficient.
That's a crucial point. And when you multiply those per-person costs by the sheer number of encampments.
So total spending adds up fast.
Yeah.
In 2019, for these activities, San Jose spent over $8.5 million.
$8.5 million.
Tacoma, nearly $4 million.
Okay.
Chicago and Houston also spent several million dollars each on these efforts.
So where does all this money actually come from?
Well, the National Alliance makes a really important distinction here. Federal HUD funding generally cannot be used for the actual removal of encampments or for policing related to them.
Okay, so that means...
It means the vast majority of these costs fall on city budgets, and ultimately that means local taxpayers. Exactly. The study highlighted that in Tacoma, an astonishing 97% of the funding for encampment responses came directly from the city. In Chicago, it was 91%.
Wow.
And while outreach is part of it, the article also points out a key inefficiency. When services are offered under the threat of immediate removal, well, they're often less effective.
Yeah, I can see that. It probably erodes trust.
It absolutely can. Makes people less likely to engage with the very services meant to help them.
And it doesn't even sound like these evictions are a lasting fix.
Often not. The article notes that in many cases, much like what we've seen in San Francisco, encampments tend to reappear relatively quickly after being cleared.
So it's like a very expensive cycle that doesn't really solve the underlying problem.
Pretty much. An expensive and, you could argue, ultimately ineffective cycle. So you've got these significant sums being spent on clearings, but then when you look at the sheer scale of homelessness in California...
Yeah, that Senate Housing Committee fact sheet, it paints a stark picture.
It really does. The data reveals that in 2022, California had an astounding 181,399 homeless individuals.
Wow.
And to really grasp the magnitude, that's 28% of the entire homeless population in the United States.
28%. And the percentage of those who are unsheltered in California is particularly high.
It's alarmingly high.
Yeah.
In 2022, 68% of California's homeless population, that's 123,423 people, were living without any form of shelter.
68%.
Put that in national context.
Right.
Roughly half of all unsheltered individuals in the entire U.S. were right here in California.
And unfortunately, the trend isn't getting better.
No. The fact sheet indicates that between 2022 and 2023, the number of homeless individuals in California actually increased by nearly 10,000 people. That's a 5.7% rise.
Almost 6% in 1 year.
And it was the second largest absolute increase nationwide. Only New York saw a bigger jump in numbers.
And looking longer term.
For 2007 to 2022, California saw the largest absolute increase in homelessness overall. Over 42,000 additional people experiencing homelessness during that period, a 30% increase.
The fact sheet also breaks it down by region, using those continuums of care, or COPEs, which are basically the local planning bodies, right?
That's right. They coordinate housing and services funding. And in 2022, the Los Angeles City and County COSI reported the highest number, over 65,000 people experiencing homelessness.
Followed by New York City, I think.
Correct. But several other California coasties, like in Oakland and San Jose, also reported really significant numbers.
And when we look specifically at the percentage of people who are unsheltered, California cities really stand out.
They absolutely do. In 2023, major cities like San Jose, LA, Oakland, Long Beach, Sacramento, all had over 70% of their homeless populations living unsheltered.
70% unsheltered.
San Jose's rate was particularly high at 83%.
83%, that's almost everyone. The data on individual experiencing homelessness is also quite striking.
Yeah, California accounted for over a third, 34% of all homeless individuals in the U.S. in 2023. In a full half, 50% of all unsheltered individuals.
All right.
Only Hawaii at 76% and Oregon at 66% had higher percentages of unsheltered individuals compared to California's 75%.
75% unsheltered overall for individuals in California.
And again, the number of individuals experiencing homelessness here has climbed significantly since 2007, up by 41%. It's honestly staggering.
It really brings home the urgency, like you said, and makes you wonder about the effectiveness of current approaches when you see numbers like that.
Definitely.
It's also revealing to see the variations within the state. Tehama County, for example, had an incredibly high rate.
99%. Basically, everyone experiencing homelessness there was unsheltered, according to the fact sheet.
99. And even in the big cities, there are differences. You mentioned San Jose at 83% unsheltered in 2023.
Right, compared to 81% in Los Angeles, 77% in Sacramento, 76% in Oakland. Still incredibly high across the board, but variations exist.
What about families with children and unaccompanied youth? How does California look there?
Well, California accounts for a smaller slice of families, with children experiencing homelessness nationwide, about 14% in 2023. And a lower percentage within that group are unsheltered, around 23.5%.
Okay, so slightly different picture for families.
Slightly. But for unaccompanied youth, it's different again. California had the largest number in the nation in 2023, over 10,000 young people.
Wow.
That's over a third of the U.S. total. And nearly half of them, 49%, were unsheltered.
Nearly half of homeless youth unsheltered.
That's tough to hear.
Yeah.
And sadly, the numbers for veterans and those experiencing chronic homelessness are also a major concern.
They are indeed. California accounts for 30% of all homeless veterans across the U.S.
30%.
with a high rate of 70% being unsheltered. Very high.
70% of homeless veterans unsheltered.
And similarly, for chronic homelessness, nearly half, 47%, of all chronically homeless individuals nationwide were in California in 2023.
Almost half. And an even higher percentage, 56%, were living without shelter. The fact sheet also points to a worrying increase in the number of chronically homeless individuals in California over time.
This data, it just truly underscores the immense scale and the complexity of the homelessness crisis here. It's clearly not a simple issue with easy fixes.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that brings us to some of the alternative perspectives and potential solutions being discussed.
Right, like the San Jose Spotlight article, it sheds light on the views of homeless advocates who are actively protesting Governor Newsom's recent order.
Yes, they gathered at a former encampment site in San Jose, known as the Jungle, to voice their strong opposition.
And their central argument is
basically that these sweeps essentially criminalize the state of being unhoused, and that they're ultimately counterproductive if there aren't real, readily available alternatives put in place first, like housing or safe places to go.
They raise some really critical points, don't they?
Yeah, they do. Advocates talk about how sweeps can severely damage morale, often lead to the loss of essential belongings, ID, medication, things like that.
Yeah.
And they scatter people, which makes it even harder for outreach workers to provide consistent support or build trust. They also challenge the claim that sweeps effectively connect people with case management. Often they say that just doesn't happen consistently.
So what are they calling for instead?
Their demands are pretty clear.
Yeah.
Stop the sweeps unless there are designated alternative locations for people to go. They want access to safe shelter, maybe sanctioned sleeping sites, and a genuine sustained investment in affordable housing solutions.
Right. Addressing the root cause.
Exactly.
Okay.
They also argue that the significant funds spent on sweeps are just, a misallocation of taxpayer dollars that could be much better used elsewhere.
The article also highlights a pretty sobering statistic for Santa Clara County.
It does. For every one person who is successfully housed there, nearly 2 others become homeless.
Wow, that really shows the uphill battle.
It starkly illustrates the challenge of just keeping pace with the crisis, let alone reducing it.
Mm-hmm.
And tragically, they also point to the high number of deaths among the homeless population in the county.
Mm-hmm.
suggesting that the constant disruption and stress of sweeps might even be a contributing factor to some of those preventable losses.
I mean, those numbers aren't just statistics, right? They represent individuals, and the disruption of sweeps likely makes already vulnerable people even more vulnerable.
Precisely. Alpana Agarwal from Helping Hand Silicon Valley is quoted describing sweeps as a futile exercise and simply punishing people who are homeless.
Yeah.
It really captures that frustration.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to contrast this with some of the comments on the San Jose Spotlight article itself.
Oh, what are people saying there?
Well, while there's definitely support for the advocate's viewpoint, you also see community members expressing their own frustration with the visible encampments. Some voice support for the idea of low-cost, accessible shelters, but also maybe mandatory transitions for individuals who repeatedly refuse help. It really highlights the diverse and sometimes conflicting opinions within the community itself.
It's definitely not a monolithic view. Circling back to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, their stance is pretty firm, right?
Yes. They believe that directing funding towards housing-focused strategies, housing-first approaches, things like that represents a far more effective and ultimately more cost-efficient use of public money.
So invest in housing, not sweeps.
Essentially, they emphasize that while building affordable housing and providing housing assistance, it's not cheap, nobody pretends it is,
Right.
but they offer a permanent solution to homelessness and have the potential to significantly reduce long-term public spending by addressing the root causes.
Their argument is that taxpayers should push for greater investment in affordable housing assistance.
As a more humane and, in the long run, more effective way to tackle the crisis.
Yeah. Now, it's important to acknowledge the Newsom administration's perspective, too. As detailed on the governor's website, they do assert that progress is being made.
Right. They point to things like a slowing in the overall growth rate of homelessness in California compared to previous years.
And reductions in veteran and youth homelessness compared to trends in other states, I believe?
Correct. They highlight those specific areas.
Yeah, however. We also have to consider the findings of that state audit from 2024.
Yes, the AP reported on that. It indicated that while California has spent billions, truly, billions on addressing homelessness,
there hasn't been a consistent or effective system in place to actually track whether that spending is leading to significant, measurable improvements.
Right, billions spent, but the tracking of outcomes has been lacking, according to the audit, which makes it hard to assess the true impact.
So we're left navigating some really significant tensions here, aren't we?
Absolutely.
There's the undeniable urgency felt by many communities to address the visible and often challenging homeless encampments.
Mm-hmm.
Yet we have to carefully weigh the substantial financial costs and the very real human costs associated with simply evicting people.
And balance that against the fundamental need to develop long-term sustainable solutions.
Yeah.
Housing, services, prevention.
And as all that data from the Senate Housing Committee just hammers home, the sheer scale of homelessness in California is immense. The issue is incredibly intricate. There are so many contributing factors, and clearly no easy one-size-fits-all answer.
Exactly. It's deeply complex.
So this all leads to a really important question, I think, for you, the listener, to consider. Given the data we've talked about, the persistence of homelessness, the high costs of just clearing encampments, the very different perspectives on what works, what do you think might truly constitute a sustainable solution?
Yeah, what does that look like?
One that effectively addresses both the immediate concerns of communities and the long-term needs of unhoused individuals. And maybe, what distinct role should different levels of government, state, county, city, and local communities themselves play in actually achieving that kind of solution?
It feels like that's the ongoing deep dive we all need to be a part of, figuring that out.